This is Metabolic Mastery, a core medical technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Welcome to Metabolic Mastery, brought to you by Core Medical Technologies. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert. This is Dr. Cameron Garber. And today we are going to be talking about a foundational topic. So it's load versus capacity. We'll dive into exactly what that means, why that's important, how testing your VO2 max, getting your heart rate zones can be crucial for helping us manage load in an appropriate way. So let's dive right in. Cameron, what is load? Why is this concept even important?
Well, from my standpoint, the most important thing with training is consistency, that we stay consistent. And one of the biggest things that makes us inconsistent is fatigue, injury, and burnout. And so managing load versus our current capacity to bear that load is so critical in being able to be consistent. Because if we get an injury or we get burned out or we're just over fatigued, we're not going to stay consistent. It frustrates consistency. And so I love anything that helps us live to play another day. That's kind of my mentality with exercise. And when I'm working with patients to become consistent in their exercise, that's what we focus on more than anything else. The tactics of the how are much less important than can we do this again tomorrow and the next day and the next, because it's the consistency that's really going to lead to success in the long run. It doesn't matter how hard I work out today. If I don't do it again tomorrow and the next day and the next, it's not going to be that effective. And so it's more important that we stay consistent than it is that we have this amazing workout today.
Well, so I think that is such an important point, because when we talk about the best workout, that's a really loaded term.
Right.
And kind of the way that I look at it is the best workout is the one that you're going to do consistently, because you might be able, I'm going to design the most amazing workout and it'll have exactly the right stimulus that's going to drive everything. But, oh, you didn't do that. Or, oh, you got burnt out, or, oh, you got injured. And so what can I do consistently and to keep me in the game? And one of the things that you and I always talk about is how the only training that matters is training that you can recover from. And so being careful about how the stresses that we're applying to our body, how we're training, how we're recovering is really crucial for load. And load really is it's the total amount of stress that we place on our body in a given day and over time. And I think the important thing to understand about that is that load is not just training load, right? Volume, intensity, frequency, etc. It's all the different stressors in our life. And so load can come from so many different places.
Yeah.
And I think there's often a lot of what we might call hidden load, right? We don't think about how is my sleep impacting me, right? I got poor sleep, that's a load. How is major stressors, right? Am I having relationship issues? Is there something big at work happening, right? Am I worried about this or that? And all of that combines together to create the total load on us. And so I think if we aren't aware of some of those other stressors and some of those invisible or hidden stressors, then we can have a really good training plan, but then we get extra load dumped in that we weren't aware of or we weren't accounting for. And then we end up getting in an overload issue.
Right.
So I want you to talk about, there's some terms that Cameron hates. So I want you to talk about overload versus overuse.
Okay. So overuse.
Semantics.
This is totally semantics, but it really speaks to the psychology of an injury. So the term overuse is actually a false term. There's no such thing as overuse. You never overused a joint or a muscle or whatever to cause the injury. You overloaded it, whether that's chronic overloading over time or acute overloading. You overloaded that tissue beyond its current capacity. The term overuse creates this idea in our head that we somehow, did something wrong by doing that exercise. There's nothing wrong with it. And there's somebody else using that tissue in the way that you're using it more than you are, right? So it's not that you overused it. You just overloaded it for its current capacity. And so we just need to build up its capacity to bear that load. and it can do just about anything. So when we tell people, oh, you overused it, they think that running is the problem or cycling is the problem or whatever, weightlifting is the problem. When those things aren't the problem, it's just you did more of it than that tissue was currently capable of bearing. And so if that's acute overloading, it can be something as simple as I stepped in a pothole and sprained my ankle. That is a training error because we made a misstep and we acutely overloaded that ligament more than it was currently able to bear. But you can stand on the side of your foot in the same position to the same amount of inversion as what that ankle sprain caused. You can stand on the side of your foot because you apply that load slowly enough and it can bear that just fine. Yeah, we often will use the analogy of dropping a brick on your foot. You can acutely load the tops of your toes with a brick and it will cause injury. Whereas if you set that brick on your toe, it would be just fine. And theoretically, if you trained your body to slowly start dropping that brick from 1 inch, and then from 2 inches, and then from 3 inches, you could eventually get where you could drop that brick on your foot and it wouldn't injure it if you built up its capacity to bear that. And we see this in kickboxers and things like that. Two guys kicking each other in the shin, or they'll break bricks and things like that, and their body's able to handle that. It's because they've built up their capacity to be able to kick bricks and not have it break their foot. Whereas if I went out and tried to kick a brick right now, I'm pretty sure it would cause some trauma.
Yeah. Well, you look at same thing with pitchers. You look at the bones in their arm,
Yeah.
and it's much thicker. And if someone who wasn't trained for being a throwing athlete were to experience those same forces, like likely that bone would break.
Well, or ligaments would tear and things like that. So a professional baseball pitcher actually has considerably more external rotation range of motion in their shoulder. And it's there, if you look at the anatomy of their bones, it's actually changed to allow for that. If somebody went through that same range of motion under those same forces, it would cause a lot of damage.
Yeah.
And so that they've just built up their capacity to bear the loads in those ways. And so they've earned the right to move in that way over time. And so that's kind of the crux of this whole idea is load versus our capacity to bear that load. And so load, like Mark mentioned, can come in lots of different ways. So physical stressors, psychological, physiological stressors, that lots of different ways in which load can be applied. When we talk about training and training improvement, the biggest thing that changes our ability to perform a task better is the total volume of training. That's the number one thing. The more training we can get at a specific task, the more likely we are to make improvement. That the training volume includes the intensity and the frequency. And the key is to get more frequency of training in, more total volume of training in, we often have to decrease the intensity or just manage the intensity to get the optimal amount. So with intense training, we kind of switch the volume curve where we get a higher load in a shorter period of time, but then it requires more recovery and things like that. So you have to balance out the volume of training with the intensity of training. We mentioned that in another episode, but that balancing that out is really critical, and that's kind of the whole point of this load versus capacity conversation.
Absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the usefulness of the testing, heart rate zones, et cetera. But it's understanding that like our bodies are incredibly adaptable. That's the really cool thing.
Yeah.
And that's the hopeful thing about the idea of load and how we load and overloading and everything is just getting across the principle that across a lifespan, our bodies remain highly adaptable. As we age, we need a little bit more recovery, but our tissues are able to adapt across the whole lifespan. And so the crux of that, though, is that they adapt at a certain rate, right? Tissue is built at a certain rate, recovery happens at a certain rate, new bones, the turnover of everything like that. And so we've got to respect the ability of our tissues to adapt, the time span that requires. And so being able to manage the load through how we apply intensity, how we apply duration, frequency, et cetera, is all about how can I stay consistent without getting burnt out, fatigued, or injured, like Cameron said.
Right.
And so that goes to our capacity.
Right. Exactly. And the capacity, I like to view our capacity kind of like a motor and a battery, right? So like an electric car. Um, the more you have a bigger motor, the faster we can go and the less work it is on that motor to go that fast or to perform a task. So we can either go longer because it's less work for it, or we can go faster when we have a greater capacity within the size of the motor. But then we also have the capacity of the battery. And so we can have a battery that either delivers more, watt hours more quickly, which will drive that engine faster, or we can have a battery that has a long reservoir of watt hours. And so those are different ways that we can create endurance versus power output. Um, and both of those are helpful in the equation of our overall capacity and our ability to bear load depending on the way that we're applying that load.
Yeah, so I think that's such an important thing. I want to reiterate that both that power aspect, being able to use our strength quickly and being able to endure for a long time, both are crucial for not only performance, but for longevity. Um, Power becomes an especially important issue as we age, right? The risk of falls goes up exponentially after the age of 65.
Yeah.
And so that's because people don't have enough ability to use their muscles, use their strength quickly, and they fall. And so developing both of those through our training is super important for staying healthy. And so capacity really is our ability to handle and to recover from load.
Mm.
And the thing to understand is that it's not fixed, right? It can vary, over time as we improve our capacity, right? As we train in a way that drives our body to adapt, but also going back to some of those other stressors. If I've gotten uh, poor sleep, or if I'm not fueling myself well for recovery and for exercise, if I have a lot of those external stressors or an acute stressor, right? I've got a test coming up or whatever, that can temporarily reduce my capacity. And so I might be applying the same training load, but my capacity has changed because some of those other factors. And so being aware of my capacity and managing that in such a way that I'm trying to keep that capacity large is super crucial.
Yeah.
I think another element to understand is, what were you talking about is having that big reservoir. Looking at our capacity as that reservoir is important for understanding why it's so crucial to stay fit, to stay healthy, to have good endurance and good power. Because as much as we want to avoid injury, as much as we want to avoid illness, sometimes that's inevitable, right? I get sick, or I step off that curb and I roll my ankle, or I get in a car crash, or something happens, right? And I am not able to train in the same way for a certain time, right? I'm sick, and so I can't do my regular regime of running or lifting. I'm bedbound for a while because I got in that car crash. If I have a large reserve, and we call something like that a catabolic crisis, it just means that there's the potential for a lot of breakdown in our tissues to occur. And so what can happen is we don't have a large reserve of capacity, is that when that injury, when that illness occurs, we drop down to the level of disability. And then life is really difficult. Moving around the house, doing simple daily tasks like going grocery shopping or cleaning the house or going up and down stairs can be really difficult. Versus if we have that large reserve of capacity, we might draw down on that, but we don't draw down to the level of disability. And so it's much easier to build that reserve back up after we've gotten injured.
So to kind of visually take a look at load versus capacity, right? So if this is the load that I'm currently applying on my body, and this is all the things. So my stress, my sleep, my workouts, everything. This is the load that I'm currently applying to my body. And this is my capacity. So they're about equal, right? And then I decide I want to do a speed workout. So I increase the load by quite a bit. My capacity to handle that stays the same. If I don't take recovery, we can actually drive our capacity down if we don't do enough to recover. But if I do a little bit and allow my body to build up, right, we can build up our capacity over time. But if, let's say, I do step in that hole and all of a sudden and twist my ankle, I've increased the load on the tissue really quickly. My capacity didn't move with it because we can't adapt that quickly, and I get injury. Depending on how I handle that injury, my capacity can really start to drop down. So we have to be so careful in the way that we're dealing with injuries, illness, fatigue, these catabolic crises, that we're doing enough to maintain as much of our capacity as possible so that we're not seeing, acute load spikes sabotage everything. The other thing is that managing load over time is so critical so that we don't see a chronic overload, that we're never able to get our capacity back up because we're always chronically overloading where our current capacity is. So what we want is to overload enough that our capacity will build up and even grow past the load that we're putting on it if we apply that load correctly. So we have to give it enough time and to be able to build up. Our body is really good at bolstering itself up. It just takes more time. And so we have to be careful with that. And so that leads into, well, how do we manage that load? How do we know where that is? Honestly, heart rate is one of the greatest ways to manage load. And so to get accurate heart rate zones via VO2 testing is a great way to manage load, because your heart rate lets you know what's going on. It really is one of the best barometers we have into exercise load, because it fluctuates from day to day. You can go out on the same trail or road or whatever, and run at the same pace, and your heart rate on 2 different days will be wildly different because of all of the other factors that are influencing the load that we're putting on our system. And so, my son fails a math test the day before. I go run the same trail I ran yesterday, and my pace is significantly slower at the same heart rate. Or I keep the pace the same and my heart rate's 15 beats per minute higher. Why is that? Well, because I got poor sleep, because I was thinking about my son's math test, and because I was stressing about that, it overloaded some of my systems, my cognitive, uh, effort put behind stressing about that, the cortisol levels and all of those things increase the stressors. And so my heart rate may have a different response. And so I love heart rate because it is such a good way of looking at what is the total load on the system. So if I go out on that run and my body's fighting off a cold, for example, I may not know it. I may be totally fine, but my body's fighting off a cold. And so it is doing work in the background that I have no idea. And so I go on this run and everything seems fine. I'm well hydrated. It's not too hot. All of these things. Why is my heart rate so much higher? If I don't respect the fact that my heart rate's high and I just go on my run and stick to my paces instead of respect the heart rate and slow down, my likelihood of getting that cold is going to be much higher, because now I'm putting more stress on the system beyond its current capacity. And so now I'm more likely to get that illness that's going to then keep me from being able to work again tomorrow and the next day and the next. And so sticking with that heart rate, despite the fact that yesterday I was able to do this just fine, really does allow me to live to play another day. It gives me the ability to do it again the next day and the next and the next. And so often we have to swallow our pride a little bit and just think load versus capacity. For some reason, my load is a little bit higher today than what my current capacity is. And that's the thing that fluctuates from day to day. And so getting your proper zones from VO2 testing and making sure that you have your correct heart rate zones so that you can see where you're at and where those heart rate fluctuations are coming from allows you to have better insight into that. So you can kind of go through that checklist of, okay, what's creating load? Do I have stressors? Psychological, family stressors, financial, whatever. Is there something stressing me out? Is there something that, like, environmental? So is it really a lot hotter today? Did I go later in the day? Am I dehydrated? Nutrition, have I changed anything up? You can kind of go through this checklist to say, why is my heart rate higher? If you don't have a reason, it could be that you're fighting something off that you don't know about, and you're just better off sticking with that so that you can live to play another day.
Well, so that point is so crucial, is we so often get on our own way because we think, oh, I have to be perfect, right? I have to stick to the plan. I can't have a day off. And then that ends up sabotaging our progress.
Right. We wind up getting injured, and then what's the point, right? Taking 6 to 8 weeks off because of my most recent injury is going to inhibit your progress way more than maybe running 30 seconds slower pace today than I did yesterday.
Yeah. And I'm playing the long game. And so
Exactly.
understanding your body well enough to be able to do that is crucial. And we've said before, like exercising without knowing your heart rate, right? Doing those runs without knowing your heart rate is like lifting without knowing how much weight is on the bar.
Yeah.
And so we don't have a good idea of what's the load that I'm putting on the system. And people just tend kind of the self-selected pace is good for general cardiovascular health, but in terms of progress, it often limits progress because it dips too much into that recovery bucket. And so what Cameron was talking about, right? Are we increasing load a little bit and allowing capacity to rise, load capacity, right? What we call functional overreaching or progressive overload. If we go too much or we're not recovering enough between efforts, then we err into non-functional overreaching or overtraining, what people will call. And it just means that our body is not able to keep up in terms of adaptations with the load that's being placed on it. And so knowing those heart rate zones and having them dialed in according to what's happening in our body is really crucial. And so the VO2 max test, that's a nice number to have. But as we've talked before, VO2 max isn't end all be all. That gives us an idea of our capacity, and it's definitely something to improve, right? We want to improve our body's ability to use oxygen to fuel our movement, but also understanding some of the other things that this type of testing can reveal. And so one of the big things is how our body uses substrate and how that plays into heart rate zones. You want to talk about that, Cam?
Yeah. So the fat versus carbohydrate utilization, and that's essentially the substrate utilization. And why it's great to be able to optimize fat burning during workouts is it allows us essentially to have that bigger battery. I can go longer, and over time as we train that, we can go longer at a higher intensity before fatiguing because our reservoir is much larger of fat in our body than carbohydrate, and there's less kind of metabolic waste product and things like that. So we can go longer if we can train our body to burn fats better. We can go higher into our heart rate and thus higher into effort levels and all those things. You can over time make it so what once was an easy zone 2 or what once was a zone 3 effort can become an easy zone 2 effort with training over time. And so that idea of training your body to burn fat better takes some time and takes training at a lower intensity more often so that you can increase that capacity. Well, so that you can train your body to burn fats well, and then the zone 4-5, especially zone 5 efforts, are what helps increase our capacity. If we did all zone 5 efforts, then we'd be always in a recovery state and not able to actually build up. We'd always be trying to catch back up to the load that we're putting on our body, and we'd never be able to actually build our capacity above the load that we're putting on it.
Well, that goes back to that idea of intensity versus duration, is that the higher the intensity, the less of it we can do because we need more recovery. And so I think we sometimes we overemphasize certain types of training or we demonize certain types of training.
Yeah.
And really it all comes back to this idea of load versus capacity.
Right.
High intensity training is crucial. It's so necessary. It creates these really positive adaptations, and it helps us to do the powerful activities.
It's really where change is made, is in the high intensity stuff.
But if we do that too often, if that's the majority of our workouts, then, like Cameron said, it outpaces our ability to adapt, and we end up, again, with fatigue, burnout, injury. And so we need that in small doses, but that intensity dips much more into our recovery bucket than volume, like higher volume at a lower intensity does.
Right.
And so hence the reason for a lot of that zone 2, low intensity, high volume of training.
Right.
Being able to do that consistently day after day after day is a really strong stimulus for adaptation. So we get this like lower intensity, high volume stimulus. We get this higher intensity, but shorter duration stimulus. And combined together, that creates these really positive adaptations for health, for performance, and for longevity.
Right. So I like to think of it as the zone 2 training maintains the base. Like it's enough load on the system that it keeps our body having to keep it at that level. But then the zone 4-5 stuff is what bumps us up a level and then we're maintaining that with the zone 2 work, and then the zone 4 or 5 bumps us up a level. And so we can make that stepwise progression. If we were to just do zone 2 work though, we wouldn't maintain that forever because life doesn't work that way. We always say maintenance is a lie. If we're just maintaining, life, aging, things like that are going to slowly drop that curve down. And so we have to do those zone 4 or 5 efforts to bump up our capacity. If we're not improving, we're actually dropping off. Maintenance doesn't really work because of life.
Yeah.
Because of all those different sources of load on the system, it's going to over time reduce our capacity if we're not trying to grow our capacity.
Absolutely. And so when you look at kind of what's the best split, the research kind of hones in on an 80-20 low intensity to high intensity.
Overall. Right. So you can have periods of 70-30 or periods of 90-10. Overall, it should average out around 80% zone 2, 20% zones 4 and 5.
And it's not because there's just some magic number, right? Our body knows like, oh, when I hit that exact percentage, then that will fuel on my performance. It goes again back to this load versus capacity idea. That seems to be the ratio. Again, there's certain times that we can overreach a little bit more and we're periodizing our training. But with that overall aggregate of 80-20, that seems to be the amount that allows our body to optimize for adaptation while minimizing fatigue, burnout, and injury.
Right. It's enough to trigger capacity increase without overloading.
Yep.
Is essentially the idea behind it. And so, yeah, there could be periods where you're 60-40 for a couple of days, but then you need a few weeks of 90-10. And, you've got to balance that out over time to make sure that during those peak phases where we're intentionally, overloading somewhat, that we do enough in recovery so that we balance out the load versus capacity equation. That's the idea. And as long as we do that sensibly and manage those periods of purposeful overloading with purposeful recovery, we can handle that fine and we'll build up and do great. And so it's just being very aware of the fact of all of the different factors of load that we're putting on our body. And that's why I love monitoring heart rate, and why I feel like VO2 testing is so important, is making sure we have accurate heart rate zones, that we're tracking that over time through those training cycles so that we know how heart rate zones are changing. And then we're using those zones to help monitor the amount of load. Because again, from day to day, the same workout may be much more load on the system than it was a day or two ago because of other factors.
Absolutely. Well, and then just using that heart rate to what we call auto-regulate our training. It's just adapting on a day-to-day basis based on how our body responds and respecting those different triggers or different stressors. And I think if we understand that and we have those zones dialed in, that's going to be a lot better. That's the difficulty with things that estimate heart rate,
right?
Is that it might get you in the ballpark, but you may be inadvertently training in higher intensity and not knowing it. And then again, you're dipping too far into that recovery capacity. And so dialing in on those zones through precise testing really allows us to make sure that we're getting that stimulus and managing fatigue well.
Right. So oftentimes I'll have, marathoners or triathletes or cyclists bring me a training plan and say, what do you think of this training plan? And it's like, I often think, I don't always say this out loud, but it's like, well, that looks like a really good way to get injured if you follow it rigidly, right? So not that it's a poorly thought out training plan. It's just if you follow this straight out the window without being willing to adjust and adapt, especially training plans that follow like strict progressions of pace and mileage, that's a great way to get injured. If you're not using heart rate to dial that in and being willing to say, oh, today, for whatever reason, I'm running a lot slower, so I'm going to take a mile or two off of today's training because I'm just not feeling it. Or if you're just too rigid to sticking to the plan without adapting to how you're doing on any given day, then it's a great way to get injured. If your plan is flexible and allows you to adapt and adjust, and I personally believe in training plans that are based more on time and heart rate than mileage and pace. I feel like mileage and pace training is a great way to get injured.
Yeah.
Because you feel like you have to get that in to be successful.
Right. Well, and it has good principles, right? It's important to have enough
Totally.
structure that you are moving towards your goals, right? Does your effort match your goals?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
enough flexibility to allow for life to be exactly as it is, to allow for changes based on those daily, weekly,
Right.
whatever
The
stressors that pop
failed
up.
math tests, the, job stressors or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And so obviously a great thing to look at heart rate. How am I doing on a day-to-day basis? And sometimes we'll still see, man, I was doing really well and now things are plateauing, right?
Yeah.
And what's happening? And people feel like they're just beating their head against a wall. How do I get out of this plateau?
Right.
And so I think there's some really positive things that we can do when we hit that plateau. Obviously, looking at how is heart rate responding, but going back to this understanding of what is load. Load is not just our training load. It's that combination of all of those physical, psychological, and physiological stressors that add into that bucket. And so what I found really helpful for when people are experiencing a plateau or even dropping off is doing some sort of lifestyle audit. And
Hmm.
so looking into each of those areas, my exercise, has my training intensity or overall volume increased significantly lately, or even over the past couple of weeks and months. Oh, that's something that we're gonna pause here and go back really quick. Here's the difficulty, and Cameron talked about it earlier. We don't always know when we are doing that non-functional overreaching. And so sometimes people will begin an exercise program and they'll get into it pretty quickly and they don't notice anything at first. It takes time for the effects to accumulate. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, my hamstring is killing me, or oh, my back hurts so much. What did I do that day? And often it's not something that they did on that day, it's that cumulative load over time. And so
Yeah.
this is such an important question to ask ourselves regularly. Have there been any sharp increases in activity, in volume and intensity that may contribute to where I'm at right now? And looking at that, did I just do too much too fast?
Right. Often you can just look at somebody's step count and be like, and I know when your injury happened, it's this week where you doubled your number of steps compared to most weeks. Disneyland is a great one.
Oh yeah.
You'll see people that are like, oh, I've got plantar fasciitis and blah, blah, blah. I've been training for this marathon. And so I'll look at their average step counts and stuff like that and be like, whoa, what happened here? And it's like, oh, we took a family vacation. And I kept running through that. So my step counts went to, 40, 50,000 steps a day for a week. And then I came home and kept running. And that next week, man, plantar fasciitis just hit me. And it's like, well, yeah, that tracks. You doubled, tripled the amount of time, thus load on your feet that your body's normally used to. So that would track, even though, you didn't do anything, you were just walking around Disneyland, but for a massive amount of volume increase.
Yeah.
And so that type of a thing is often, if you look at some of those clues, step count is a great one for identifying when an injury happened. And like Mark said, it's not often an event. It can often be cumulative load.
Yeah. So looking at that, looking at some of the mental, emotional factors. So have I had any recent new stressors, right? A job change or a really big project at work? Am I having some sort of relationship issues?
Yeah.
Are there things like that mentally and emotionally that are adding some of that load? What does my sleep hygiene look like? Am I getting high quality sleep? And am I doing that consistently, or is something affected my sleep? So Cameron was just talking to me earlier about summer
Oh,
and his kids.
teenagers. Yeah, they never go to bed.
Weird. And
Yeah.
so it's just like, oh, I'm so tired, right? There's this
Right.
big change. And so what's changed? Or did I get a new bed and I'm just not sleeping as well, or
Yeah.
things like that?
So it's important to recognize the signs of when I'm overtraining. If we're feeling excessively hungry, if we're feeling excessively tired, if we're feeling, noticing heart rates are different for the same amount of load, those types of things are great indicators. Heart rate elevation at usual paces or intensities. I'm trying to go through the list. Tired, hungry. What else?
Yeah, I mean, it's just
There's
I feel
one
like I
other
can't
that
get enough sleep.
yeah, there's one other that I can't. Anyway,
One, so it's am I having trouble like solving problems? Right? Is my thinking clear?
yeah,
Can I what would
yeah,
cognitive
cognition,
avoidance? There you go.
all of those things, stress management. Sometimes that can be the fact that we've already maxed out our nervous system. That's something you like to talk about quite a bit. is the overload on our nervous system can often impact the overall load, the central fatigue versus.
Well, and
Yeah, go ahead.
what's just something interesting to think about that is when I want to make good decisions for my training, for my lifestyle, etc. If I'm constantly dipping too much into that recovery bucket and I can't think as well, then I make poor decisions,
Right.
both like mentally and emotionally, that can add more stress, right? I choose to go too intensely at a workout, or I say something that I wish I didn't to another person or something like that because I have just I've overloaded my nervous system and I'm literally not thinking clearly. I'm not recovering well, and so that's impacting everything else. And so
Chronically hangry.
chronically hangry, right? Who hasn't been there? But just being aware of those signs and signals, am I starting to dip into there? Can really help us to triage what's going on and find quicker solutions, so that we're not 3 months down the line and I just feel awful all the time.
Yeah.
And here's one of the difficulties: is we often see those problems. I am I'm not thinking as clearly. My sleep is really poor. I'm tired all the time. I feel like I'm getting sick all the time.
Injured all the time.
And instead of doing this kind of audit, questioning ourselves, questioning our lifestyle, we just put a band-aid on it. Oh, I'm not sleeping well. I guess I'll take some melatonin. Oh my gosh, I'm so tired when I wake up in the morning. I better onboard some caffeine. And we end up trying to hack our way out of overtraining, of this fatigue, when that's not going to solve the issue. It's looking at, like, those things can help for sure,
Right.
for sure. But am I doing this kind of lifestyle audit to see if there's factors that are modifiable,
Right.
and that are often simply modifiable? I can just turn the dial on that and start to have really positive effects on my recovery and get out of that plateau.
And the other thing we often see people do is blame the activity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to get niggles with my runs or my rides, or I'm starting to notice when I lift that my knees hurt or my back hurts or things. And so we blame the activity. Oh, weightlifting must be bad for my back. Running must be bad for my knees, when neither are true. Weightlifters actually have fewer back problems and back injuries and things like that if they do it sensibly. Same with runners. Running is actually protective to your knees. Runners have fewer joint problems, fewer joint surgeries, blah, 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 if you run according to your capacity and don't overreach there. And so we often, though, blame the activity versus take a look at what could I do to modify so that I'm exercising according to my current capacity, so I'm not overloading according to where my current capacity is. And we see this a ton with people just starting out in an exercise. January 1st, they hit it really hard. I used to run 5 miles a day, so I want to get back into it. I signed up for a half marathon, went out and ran 5 miles every day this week, and now my knees hurt. Running must be bad for me. I can't tell you in my physical therapy practice how many times I've heard that story.
Yeah.
And so they go and run 20 miles in a week when they haven't run for several years. And now they're wondering why everything hurts. And it's like, well, you didn't earn the right to run 20 miles in 1 week, right? Start where you're at and build from there. Just because you used to be able to do it doesn't mean your body's still capable of that. Your capacity to handle running has lowered quite a bit. And so you have to apply that load at where you're at and then build up from there. And that's one of the things that I love VO2 testing for,
Mm-hmm.
is I can take a look at where is zone 2 for that person and how do we build them up? Because maybe 5 miles, if done slowly enough, wouldn't be as bad. If they did 5 miles of walking, because that's where their heart rate zones are set right now, is where zone 2 is actually just a walking pace. And so they could handle that possibly if they're stuck on the 5 miles. I would argue start at like 20 minutes and keeping your heart rate in the heart rate zone, and then grow the volume and then the intensity of that training over time. And you're going to be less likely to get injured. There's kind of a hierarchy of how to build things up. First, we talk about frequency. You want to build up how often you can do an exercise first. So frequency, and then the duration of that activity, and then the intensity. We often focus too much on the intensity first. How much weight can I lift? How much, how fast can I run? Or how when we start out, we want to see what we're still capable of. So we go out and run a mile as fast as we can, or a 5K as fast as we can, or we try to see what is my 1 rep max with the weights and things like that, before just taking a couple of weeks to condition myself to that activity first, before we go after a 1 rep max, or to do a time trial on our 5K or whatever. Instead, build up your capacity a little bit first, kind of get back into the activity, and then test those things. But if we build up first our frequency, then our duration, and then the intensity of an activity, that seems to be the safest way to build up our capacity while avoiding injury.
Yeah. And because intensity does require more recovery, when we do increase intensity, sometimes it can be a good idea to back off on the duration or the frequency a little bit, just so we can absorb that new load. But again, while intensity is important, it's only one part of the equation. And again, this goes back to the VO2 testing. Like, I find my VO2 max, that gives me an idea of the size of the engine, and I do want to increase the size, the power of my engine. But that tells me little about the efficiency of my engine. And so when we can look into that metabolic, that substrate data, and find out how is our body utilizing fat and carbs, then we know what type of training I need to do to make that engine more efficient. So not only
Right.
can I go, faster, quicker, but I can go for a longer period of time. And
Right.
it's both those domains that are important.
Right. It speaks to the size of the battery running that engine. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so knowing that and training in such a way to improve those qualities really helps us to, again, avoid those plateaus and avoid those three things: fatigue, injury, burnout. Obviously, there's going to be some level of fatigue with anything, but it's maximizing adaptation while minimizing the effects of fatigue and injury.
Mhm.
And as we do that consistently, we can see really amazing effects, right? We've worked with people that plateaued for really long periods of time. And then finally, when they applied this style of training, when they found out, how does my body actually working? How am I metabolizing energy? Then they could apply that and start to make changes and stop getting injured.
Right.
That's the cool thing to see.
It's so fun to talk to somebody 6-8 weeks later after training with kind of that hybrid 80-20, so the zone 2 and zone 4-5 workouts, where they really start polarizing in their training, talking about how much better their body feels. Like, my knees don't hurt anymore. I feel so much better. I can do this every day now, whereas before I was only running 3 days a week. Things like that you're like, yeah, when you train according to your body, it's amazing how much more you can do. And so now their total volume of training is much, much higher. So they're able to make more progress because they feel well, they're not injured, and they're respecting their body on a day-to-day basis by listening to that heart rate.
Right. They recognize that they've earned the right to do that thing. And so that's the thing, is going back to how foundational this principle of load versus capacity is. It governs so much. And when we understand that on a basic principles level, it can just help us keep from hitting our head against a wall, wondering why things aren't working, or going down the wrong rabbit hole, chasing the wrong thing. When we recognize that it really is that load versus capacity issue. What do I need to change so that I can get my capacity bigger over time?
Right. So if you're noticing a problem with your training, if you're feeling any of those warning signs of hunger, fatigues, poor sleep, all those things, if you're noticing those warning signs, ask yourself, what have I done to increase the load on the system recently in all of those areas, right?
Yep. Yeah. No.
And so, yeah, what have I done to increase the load? And then what can I do to manage that? Is that more recovery? Is that better sleep? Is that better nutrition? Is that better hydration? Whatever. Is that time of day so it's not too hot outside? Whatever that is, where I've changed the load that I'm putting on the system and then making an adaptation. And that's how you can really balance this load versus capacity equation.
Yeah. And with that, you're really thinking like a scientist. And so when we're doing this kind of audit, it's not like, oh, there's all these things, I'm going to change everything at once.
Right.
Right. Tweak.
Careful.
Yeah. Careful. Right. Run little experiments. Okay. I have gotten a more consistent bedtime. What impact is that having? Right. Or I've improved the quality of my food so that I'm feeling myself better. And then just running those little experiments repeated over time, and being able to observe the changes and then run the next experiment. And so just thinking like a scientist in those things.
Yep.
So we've got this idea of load versus capacity. What is load? What is capacity? How do I manage that? How do I use testing, etc.? With that, like, when do I want to test? How often do I retest? What am I looking at in terms of this time scale for making a lot of these adaptations?
Yeah. It really varies on the goal and what you're pursuing and the mode of exercise and things like that. But the time physiological change happens for most things at a similar time rate. So I always say physiological change time is somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks. So whether it's a broken bone or adding muscle tissue or things like that, it often takes 6 to 8 weeks to really see much in the way of physiological change. And so thinking of training cycles kind of in 6 to 10 week blocks, depending on what you're doing, can be a meaningful amount of time that within that time I should see some changes. And so expecting if you sign up now for a race in 6 weeks, uh, the likelihood is you're not going to see much meaningful change during that period of time where you can expect a wild result of 6 weeks of training. You can see some improvements and things, but yeah, it's you have to be careful how quickly you're expecting change to happen. I always tell people if you want to run a race and do well and feel well, I would plan it for not this year, but next. If it's half marathon or longer, don't sign up for it this year unless you intend to get injured, feel terrible, and have that day not go well. I would maybe plan on it where this year you build up your base and next year you run your race.
Yeah. Well, and maybe changing the definition of what am I trying to accomplish this?
Right.
Maybe that next year is like, this is really going to be my PR, right? This is going to be my
Yeah,
A
where I
race.
have a good race.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then being okay, like if you're going to do one anyway, walking that or jogging that, like not trying to do the
Or
max
yeah,
effort.
I just finished race. That's fine to do. But
Yeah.
if you want to like do well, don't do it this year.
Well, and I think part of this, and this comes from personal experience, some of it is ego management.
Big time.
Can I
Big time.
stick with the long-term view enough to respect my body and make changes on the time scale that's really going to allow me to do that in the healthiest way? It's really difficult sometimes when you're the one walking on the trail and grandma and grandpa are passing you, right? Or when you have to be in the gym and you're not repping these huge weights, you're just being able to control the load and target the tissues that you're looking to adapt. Um, and that when you're looking at yourself in the mirror, like you just have respect for that process and it's okay. I don't have to be perfect right now. I'm just working towards getting better day by day, year by year.
Right. Yeah. To look at yourself and say, I'm on a journey that may be a 6 year journey, a 10-year journey to get where I really want to be. It's okay that it takes that long because you're going to get better month after month, year after year if you stick with it. And so focus on the long-term outcomes versus I want to run this race in 6 weeks, but then I'm going to get injured, take the next 6 months off and blame running for or whatever the activity is, you know, and be less fit overall by swallowing our pride a little bit and being able to say, you know what, I'm going to respect the heart rate the way it is today and make those adaptations today so that I can do it again tomorrow really will help you have that long-term success so that at 85 you're still out there crushing it and doing all the things you want to be able to do.
Yeah. Well, it's just really we want to give our bodies the best chance to succeed. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier is that we often look at the wrong things and get the wrong information, right? Oh, it was running that did this to me. I can't run anymore. Or I guess I'm just not made to move. Or I'm broken. Or I'm built wrong. Or whatever
I
we've
have
been told.
flat feet or my leg is longer than the other or my hips or whatever joints are out of alignment.
Right.
Most of those things aren't true and have very little impact on our running at all
Yeah. And
or exercise
or
at all.
exercise in general. And what they tend to tell us is that message that you're broken, you can't do this. The good days were in the past. But we've seen that that's not true. Like there are people that are out on the slopes in their 90s, right? That are still doing the activities they love and living life to the fullest because they've learned to apply these principles in a measured way such that they can stay in the game for a really long time. And so that's ultimately the message is one of hope is that you're not broken. You can adapt. It's just understanding some of these foundational principles about how your physiology and your psychology work together, and then applying that in a way that allows you to build your capacity over time without getting injured again and again. And that to me is such a more hopeful message than running is the bad thing, or you're broken, or you're built wrong, or this injury you got 20 years ago is the
It's
source of all
still
your problems.
limiting.
It's still
Yeah.
limiting you. And so
Yeah.
it's really, how can we use the technology that we have to learn how my individual body is working, what's my physiology like, and then learn how to triage that.
Right. Yeah. You bring that up. The car accident 20 years ago. Again, we hear that a lot in physical therapy practice. Oh, my neck ever since that car accident. And it's like, man, those tissues actually healed 20 years ago. It's probably fine. It's the way that you've babied and treated that neck since then that's likely more of the problem than any physiological trauma that is still existing from that accident. Like those tissues heal within 6 to 8 weeks, but often it's the guarding and the disuse that has actually led to the disability now, because we didn't maintain or build back up the capacity of that tissue. That's more likely why we still have some lingering problems because of that. And so it's taking an injury and saying, what's its current load bearing capacity, and how do I build that up so that it can bear more load and handle more activity? And if we apply that load slowly enough, all of our tissues can adapt. There's very few things that are permanent disabilities versus things that we can slowly build the capacity up for.
Yeah. I think we can think of capacity, expanding capacity, as a way to expand the options available to us. What I mean by that is, let's say that I want to lift a box overhead, or I want to take a piece of luggage and I want to put it in an overhead compartment. If I have strong lower body, strong upper body, good ability to produce power, then I can pop that up there really quick, and it's easy. But if I don't have that, my options are limited, right? I have to ask someone else to put it up there. I might try to get it up there, right? I'm kind of swinging, using my momentum to get the bag up there, because I don't have that option available. And so it's really, can I give my body a variety of options to choose from, so that it can choose kind of the most efficient option that's going to keep me the healthiest and help me avoid injury. And so we just want to expand our freedom, expand our options by increasing our capacity.
Yep. Yeah. And that's really what it's all about, is being able to do all the things you want to be able to do for as long as you can do them.
There you go. Love that.
Yep.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Hopefully you learned something. We hammered load versus capacity really hard. So if there's no other takeaways, just remember that load versus capacity.
Yep. Manage that load according to your current capacity, and you'll see success in any training program that you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, remember to like, follow, and subscribe to get more of this content, and we'll see you next time. This podcast is a production of Core Medical Technologies. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit core.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.